Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined today by Mark Finkelstein, who is the Jewish Community Relations Director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And this is The World in 5 Minutes. This week, there have been a number of different things that happened. I'm not going to go through them in any particular order, but there's some important things to note. One of the first is that there was a boycott, divestment, and sanctions proposal made at Oxford University. People tried to get the university to boycott the state of Israel, including an academic boycott, meaning that professors, books, anything coming out of Israel essentially would be banned for use by the university and by its professors. Well, this fell flat on its face, which was a wonderful thing because it sets an example for other institutions where this might be proposed. And the reason it fell flat on its face was, frankly, because the students and professors at Oxford said, how can you have a boycott against ideas? We're an institution of ideas. This doesn't make any sense at all. And the vote was overwhelmingly opposed to boycotting Israel or even institutions in the West Bank. Another thing that's going on, and frankly, the big news that's going on in the United States, every newscast is talking about this, is the sequester and the impact of what is going to happen in budget cuts. The current budget proposals will, in fact, harm the defensive capabilities of the United States and will, in fact, harm foreign aid, including to Israel. And everyone is saying we need to get around this. One of the ways that they're proposing to get around this, as far as Israel is concerned, is to consider Israel, give Israel a new designation as a major strategic ally, which is a designation that no other nation has. And the idea of that is that aid to Israel could then be separated out from aid to anybody else. That is a way to avoid the fact that should real major defense cuts or should the sequester go through, basically, instead of costing Israel the ability to have another Iron Dome system or something else to defend itself from rocket attacks from Iran, Syria, Lebanon, or Gaza at a time when all of those are relatively likely, that Israel could then be provided that, and it would be of benefit, strategic benefit, not only to Israel, but obviously to the United States as well, as it holds the line against Iran and against radical Islamists who do not like the United States. You also have going on in the West Bank and Gaza right now an attempt to start a new intifada, at least it appears to be that way, by radicals, and potentially even by the government itself. The Palestinian Authority has very little to yield in negotiations, in peace negotiations, other than conceding on violence. And if there is no violence going on, you can't concede violence. It's simply not a possibility. So there's a belief that in order to get anywhere in a negotiating position, the Palestinians have to start violence in order to ramp it down again. This is a position taken by a number of the radical groups. Hamas has repeatedly argued that the only way to get any progress is through violence, and it's fairly clear that the world wants to quiet the violence. The world wants peace to such a point that should there be ongoing violence and should it be costing lives of people on either side, the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, pressure will be brought to bear on Israel to make concessions to calm the violence. And so it makes sense to ramp up the violence in order to institute that. But Israel has gotten to the point where it's not willing to make concessions to stop the violence because it understands this whole process. So in essence, there's some question whether or not the Palestinian side would simply be wasting lives and wasting money and doing and causing serious suffering, promoting this position, and so there is opposition against it among the leadership. There is a development right now in the foreign policy of the United States with John Kerry and Chuck Hagel, now as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, in that we seem to have the development of a softer foreign policy, quote unquote, meaning that we seem to be more interested in promoting discussion with people who are unwilling to talk to us, or who are willing to talk to us so long as their agenda of arming themselves and continuing toward increased militarization is able to take place. Working with Iran, working with Hezbollah, talking to them while they increase their weaponry and develop stronger weaponry to use against us would seem to make little sense, but that is exactly what seems to be going on right now. And then finally, we talked a lot about the Israeli coalition, and we'll talk more about it during our show today. The Israeli coalition development efforts by Benjamin Netanyahu seem to be moving forward in a way in which the secular parties, Yesh Atid and Jewish Home, headed by Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, respectively, seem to be in line to be a part of the coalition along with Israel Beitenu, that's Benjamin Netanyahu's party, Israel Beitenu and Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, and creating a coalition with some of the parties in the center left, like Hatnuah and maybe Kadima. And this coalition would primarily be designed to put forward a new code of national service. It is functionally going to come across as hostile to the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties, and there is a lot of anger among those parties for the development of that coalition, and we'll talk much more about that in detail. So as we develop, as this week goes on, it's fairly clear that developments in Syria, developments with Hezbollah, developments with Lebanon are getting much and much worse, and in the weeks ahead, in fact, not in the days ahead, we're going to see a lot happening on those fronts. That is the week in 5 minutes. Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director here in Des Moines, Iowa. And I'd like to thank Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa for their support of this show, for their support of what we do. And Mark, what's going on this week? What is on your mind this morning?
Well, on my mind this morning are the developments from the European Union. I guess they can splay out in all different directions. But particularly, we've heard over the last number of weeks the contention that the European Union has poured money into some of the left-wing non-governmental organizations in Israel. Do you remember hearing that, David?
Oh, yeah. There've been lots of discussions. Many of the organizations that operate in Israel, and particularly organizations that operate in the Palestinian Authority, ones that try to advocate for the Palestinians against the Israelis, and particularly ones that advocate against the settler movement. Those organizations are said to be heavily funded, heavily supported from organizations in the European Union, and in some cases from governments in the European Union.
Right.
I know that NGO Monitor has a whole discussion of exactly that.
Absolutely, and even some of the NGOs within Israel itself, Adlada, I think, is one of them. A number who are patently, I'd say, biased in their types of reporting. Their political reporting. They have seemingly little to do with human rights and more having to do with opposition to the government of Israel.
Well, and it's absolutely the case. And in fact, what we're seeing right now is there's a growing hostility in certain quarters to Israel. And it seems to coincide with the rise in connection to what's going on in Turkey and a rise in the growth of Islam in those European countries. And Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan on Wednesday described Zionism not only as racism, which is the old canard that is despicable, but he described it as a crime against humanity. He went a step further than racism.
Right.
And he said it was on par with anti-Semitism and fascism. Speaking in Vienna at a United Nations event devoted to dialogue between the West and Islam, Erdogan decried rising racism in Europe and the fact that many Muslims who live in countries other than their own often face harsh discrimination, which is something that we should certainly oppose. We should be striving to better understand the culture and beliefs of others, but instead we see that people act based on prejudice and exclude others and despise them. And that is why it is necessary that we must consider, just like Zionism or anti-Semitism or fascism, Islamophobia is a crime against humanity.
How does one get a handle on dealing with something like that? The fact seems to be, for instance, there was a speaker at Drake University about a week ago from Turkey. It was very good. Spent most of his time talking to the student audience about the history of how the Ottoman Empire gave way to Ataturk and then Kemalism, and characterized the Erdogan regime in Turkey as moderate Islamist. That really does not show the trend that has taken place in Turkey over the past 7, 8, 9 years.
Well, what does moderate Islamist mean here, Mark?
Well,
I mean, when we're comparing, they're moderate Islamists compared to the Taliban.
Right.
But does that mean they're moderate? The answer to that, in my mind, is no, they're not moderate.
Well, the fact that some people use the term moderate Islamism links back to a philosophy having to do with the United States, trying to convince the United States that its policy should be different between extreme Islamists and moderate Islamists. And people like Barry Rubin would say there is no difference, essentially. Islamism is the same breed that wants to impose Sharia law and its restrictions on society.
I mean, if we look at what Erdogan is actually doing,
yes,
in Turkey, and that this government has arrested judges that have opposed them, has arrested secular leaders, has closed, has curtailed the freedom of speech, has done any number of other things that are anti-Western ideals.
Absolutely.
And that should be anathema to anything that we could possibly support. Here he's promoting an idea that is functionally beyond normal anti-Semitism and going to just flat-out hatred. And the European Union doesn't react to that.
Yeah,
this actually violates the European Union definition of what qualifies as anti-Semitism.
Right. The fact, though, one would expect that rational individuals in Europe would speak out against that, and that seems not. Well, obviously, look, David, you're going to talk about the push in Europe, in Britain, for more sanctions against Israel. This type of undercurrent really tries to hold sway in how Islamism and the Middle East is seen in Europe. You want to say a few words about the BDS movement in Europe?
Well, look, what's going on is the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement has gained strength in Europe. There's an attempt to get governments to do official sanctions against Israel because getting them done at other levels has failed. And what's really happened is that the military attempts to destroy Israel have failed. And so the anti-Israel movements are now resorting to diplomatic means to try to destroy Israel. And some of them are trying to push just action against settlements, against the West Bank, and others are trying to push action against Israel as a whole. Now, some of the people who are more moderate will say, well, I just want to boycott the
products that are
settlements.
coming
I
out
only
of-
want to boycott the products and the settlements.
Yeah.
But then the question is what qualifies as a settlement, one. And two, then the question is what happens if you have things that are labeled made in Israel, for example, that are actually made in those settlements, and some of these groups then want to boycott everything made in Israel because they don't know what's made in settlements. Additionally, there's a question of what is the legitimacy of Israeli life in those settlements. Now, we had a speaker here, Eugene Kantorovich, who spoke just a couple of weeks ago here, who noted that it is not illegal for somebody to cross a border and decide to live in a place. You know, the argument being made here is that the Israeli government is deliberately moving population into certain places. And that's really not what's actually going on. What's actually going on is that people are deciding they want to live in those places, and then the Israeli government is having to figure out whether, one, it can be allowed, and two, how to deal with it. Certainly in the environs of Jerusalem, that's true. Now, there may be some places where it's a little bit more ideologically motivated, particularly from the religious side of things. And most of those places, the government has actually opposed the settlement, and some places even removed settlers.
Let's back up a little bit.
Yeah.
We were talking about the BDS movement and its effect in Europe. I want to say a few words what just happened in Oxford University.
Yeah, let me get to the article about the Oxford University vote. This was
and why Oxford?
Well, Oxford, I think, is seen as one of the academic centers of the world, and so being able to have the students vote there, they really thought that if Oxford fell toward the BDS movement, that everything would fall. Oxford students voted 69-10 to defeat a motion that would have required them to support and promote the economic and political anti-Israel warfare method known as the BDS movement, and that's really what it is. So the Oxford is as the article says here, an exemplar of academic elite institutions, and it was brought there because they really thought that they had a chance. They had professors, they had students who were allied to support this, who brought arguments. They even had George Galloway, I believe, come and speak. And students were discussing the motion, voted in their own colleges. The boy and a student at Magdalen College, which is one of the colleges at Oxford, said, "This boycott goes against everything the university stands for. The idea that we are not going to read your books or articles or hear your arguments on the basis of your nationality is ridiculous." So what you've got is an understanding that the BDS movement at its extreme really is just pushing hatred of Jews in Israel.
Well, the fact is it's extreme. In many cases, if people with criticisms would do something less extreme, it would probably go over a lot better. But the fact is that the people involved in these types of movements do basically telegraph their ultimate goals, leaves it clear what their objectives are. And therefore, when you put something on the table, including a proposed academic boycott, people of fair-mindedness are going to say this is too much. You can't do that.
Well, how about the academic? How about the fact that this academic boycott is exactly what the Nazis did? Taking books written by Jews and Jewish scholars out of universities. I mean, it is so ridiculous. It's so anathema to the way that the academic world works today that essentially what the BDS movement is promoting is fascism.
It seems to be. Now, you mentioned George Galloway. Last week or so, he was on the stage and was supposed to debate BDS most probably, and his adversary turned out to be an Israeli student.
A dual citizen.
A dual citizen.
A British and Israeli citizen.
The fellow was what, 24, 21, something like that?
A student.
a student.
Yes.
And Galloway left the stage when he found out that his adversary was going to be an Israeli. That's total bigotry.
Well,
Especially,
he's definitely a bigot.
he's a bigot. Okay. Now, I'd like to make the transition to the United States and what happened at Brooklyn College.
Okay.
Do we have
Which
enough
you probably know more about than me, but
Okay.
yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, what happened at Brooklyn College is that a particular group approached the political science department and said they wanted to have a discussion of the BDS, the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, and the political science department said, okay. Now, it turns out that the panel discussion was only one-sided to begin with. And there was a big ruckus in New York City, and some people said that from the far right that you shouldn't have this on campus to begin with. So that was a canard. But the fact is you can have a real debate on a controversial topic, but basically you have to make sure what that topic is. In other words, if the BDS movement wants to, as they articulated, to cut off academic relationships with Israel, you are having a free speech debate about cutting off free speech. And I think astounded many people, and I think it astounded people like Alan Dershowitz, who articulated his opposition to that particular program, and his viewpoint was taken out of context. And the answer is yes, you can have controversial stuff, but if you're going to sponsor something like this, and it turned out to be worse than expected because some of the Jewish kids were expelled from the audience, then you really have to question what the role of the academic sponsor is.
And we'll talk about all of that right after our break. Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman, and I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And we were talking about the boycott, divestment, sanctions event at Brooklyn College before the break. And Mark, I'll let you continue where you were.
Thank you. You know, Brooklyn College is a public college in New York City funded by public funds. The issue seems not to be whether controversial topics can be debated on campus. They certainly can. The question has to do about the nature of the controversy. In this particular case, the Brooklyn College Political Science Department decided to sponsor a one-sided discussion whose attempt was to censor Israeli academics in the United States. And we've seen across the world, for example, instances where Israeli academics and other officials have been disrupted to begin with. And in this particular case at Brooklyn College, it seems to be the case that the Jewish students who were in the audience who wanted to see what was going on and perhaps to respond via questions were ejected from the audience itself. Now, underlying this is one of the speakers, I believe his name is Omar Barghouti, had written a book claiming all the worst demonization of Israel. So the question that was brought up recently in the media is, if you have somebody that really delegitimizes and demonizes the state of Israel, that basically constitutes anti-Semitism, according to the definition of Natan Sharansky, which I think has been really accepted. So the question to the political science department is, how do you feel essentially after having sponsored something that demonized and delegitimized Israel?
Well, the simple question is, why do we allow on campus now things that are basically not only bashing Israel but bashing Jews? It's fairly clear that we would not allow programs on campus that would bash any other minority. In fact, there would be rioting on campus if they tried to do those programs. But you can have a program. Let me just describe what happened at Brooklyn College here, because Brooklyn College is actually launching an inquiry into what happened. I'm going to read from an article here. Last week, the Hillel students told Tablet Magazine they were simply holding anti-BDS information sheets on their laps. But college officials alleged they were talking throughout the panel and distributing anti-BDS pamphlets to other students. Okay, first of all, there's nothing wrong with distributing anti-BDS pamphlets to other students. Okay, so that's already an issue. There shouldn't be any problem doing that as
unless
a free speech
it's
issue on campus.
disruptive of the speech.
Well, yeah, I mean, if they're standing up in the middle of the speech and throwing paper airplanes with BDS information, I can understand that. But if they're distributing the information in an appropriate way, that's a whole other thing. Meanwhile, Melanie Goldberg, one of the students who had been ousted, held her ground. She said, "We're not taking the slander to our names lightly, nor do we feel that the college had any right to evict us." She said that the college, the administration had yet to contact any of the students who were removed, and they were not aware of the investigation. Another student aired his frustrations about being ejected from the event in a New York Daily News op-ed. The investigation, it seems, may have also been initiated as part of a response to a statement released online earlier this week in which Hillel director Nadia Drucker called the BDS event decidedly non-academic and very confrontation-oriented. We're united in the belief that an investigation must ensue immediately regarding the difficulty of students easily identified as Jewish to enter the BDS event, and others as witnessed by the Dean of Student Life to be asked and then forced by security guards to leave. A few pro-Israel students also claimed that they had been turned away at the door, even though they each said they had received an email confirmation of a reserved spot. So what seems to have been the case is that this group decided that they didn't want pro-Israel people there, and therefore they thought that the Jews would be pro-Israel and therefore didn't want Jews there. And if that's the case, we're dealing with something that is anti-Semitic, flat out.
Yeah.
What we see around the country is that most of these programs are exactly that. Most of them are not discussions of whether or not boycott, divestment, and sanctions work. Most of them are simply bash Israel programs, and the people that these organizations bring in, like Omar Barghouti, are very much in that vein. They're not, let's talk about whether or not we want to have Ahava products on campus. They're, let's talk about whether or not we want to have anything to do with Israel. And that's, and how bad Israel is and how awful the Jews are who support Israel, which is the vast majority of Jews. So
if indeed this was really a very stilted discussion, essentially, the question goes back to the political science department, what its responsibility is in co-sponsoring student events to begin with. The free speech issue has been brought up, and some of the people we know said it's free speech for the political science department to sponsor or not co-sponsor any program it so desires. But when and if this investigation substantiates the claim that this was not an academically reasonable program, question then goes back to the department to see what its statement would be.
Yeah, it seems to me that you have an issue of political science departments being able to do basically whatever they want under the guise of free speech.
That's to begin with.
That's the first issue.
But then that issue then is related to the integrity of the programs that they do sponsor, and that should have some bearing on what they will or cannot sponsor.
Yeah, and I think the university needs to say that it's not okay to bring forth people who spout hatred, and it doesn't matter whether it's a great deal for the political science department, a great deal for the program that's going to bring attention to the university, like Columbia University bringing Ahmadinejad to speak. Hatred is hatred, and you can't say, oh, there are just a few Jews here, therefore it's okay, and you cannot say, oh, a few Jews think it's okay to bring this person in, even though the vast majority think that it's horrific.
Let me add a different wrinkle to it, because there was a different case I had been involved with many years ago where an administrator said, if you try to protest against this, then your speakers will be protested against, because somebody would say that my speakers promote hatred as well. So hatred is a subjective issue. The question has to do with academic fairness rather than simply the characterization of hatred per se, perhaps.
Well, it's true that the universities are simply not bringing in pro-Israel people to speak when they're bringing in the opposition. And we see that in universities in Iowa, too. It's not just anywhere else. Part of that may be that some of the anti-Israel speakers are partly funded by other organizations that have plenty of funding, and therefore they're cheaper to bring in than the pro-Israel speakers. That's entirely possible. It's certainly the case that there are fewer leading speakers pro-Israel, that they come from Washington, D.C. or New York, or they come from Israel, or they come from England, and they're more expensive to bring in. But that shouldn't be a legitimate reason, especially at this day and age where we could have people come in over the internet from anywhere and speak.
That's right.
And they'd be perfectly happy to do that.
Just as a tag to this, over the number of years, 5, 10, 15 years, a number of pro-Israeli speakers have literally been disrupted. And there were different tactics taken by those who were disrupted. I think Michael Oren, basically, who was disrupted one year, said, look, as a college, you have invited me as a guest into your home. I should be able to speak, and I will thank you for quieting down and let me finish my presentation. That didn't work. And other cases where simply the programs had been disrupted by a systematic fashion of one speaker standing up, somebody in the audience standing up, and his friend next to him then standing up and spouting off something. And that's an act of anti-university code of ethics.
Yeah, and universities need to get to the point where they're going to stand up and say that that's not okay.
Okay, that's part of it. The other thing is, just because something does occur on campus, it does not obviate the need of university senates or presidents to stand up and tell what they believe about the speaker. In other words, the Senate can censure, not censor a speaker, and that's been done successfully in different places as well. And just last word on this, there was something in England last week where a pro-Israeli speaker was disrupted, and the university knew about this ahead of time and did not do anything about it. So it's a complex topic. It's insidious in terms of what the university will or will not tolerate according to its own codes, and we have a lot of work to do on that issue.
Yeah, well, it's definitely the case in some places that the university administrators are in favor of the protest.
Well, that may be.
Or just don't want to put up with opposing the protesters, because some of the protesters are very vocal, and they'll cry Islamophobia, and they'll cry all kinds of other things.
Which brings us back to your point.
Which brings us back to the original point.
Yes.
My friend Ishmael Kaldi, a Bedouin Muslim Israeli diplomat, gets protested everywhere he goes. He tells me that he's in England right now. He gets protested in England all the time. The reality is there are Muslims who support the Israeli government. There are Muslims who believe that the Islamists and what the Islamists try to put forward is bad for Muslims. my friend Zuhdi Jasser would argue that the Islamists who are pushing for Sharia law and overcoming secularism and secular law and freedom and liberty and all of those things, that is a bad thing. So the idea that universities are going to take a stand against people who are speaking in favor of Israel or Muslims who are speaking in favor of secular ideas is really problematic. I mean, how do you have an academic dialogue if anybody who's speaking against the standard accepted point of view is shouted out of the room? Didn't we endure this stuff with Galileo? I mean,
right.
This stuff went out a long time ago, where you have somebody who argues against the prevailing point of view is shouted out of the room. I mean, and this is what's going on college campuses.
Right. May I change the topic?
Sure.
Okay. Another topic has to do with what's perceived as a softer American foreign policy. What do you know about that, David?
Well, we talked about in my introduction this issue of John Kerry and Chuck Hagel's positions regarding the Arab world, and you had Defense Secretary Hagel speaking Wednesday and telling a group of Pentagon officials that the U.S. can't dictate to the world, we must engage the world. Hagel said, we must lead with our allies. No nation as great as America is can do any of this alone. We have great power, and how we apply our power is particularly important, and engagement in the world should be done wisely. And the resources that we employ on behalf of our country and our allies should always be applied wisely. Okay, so what does that mean? We've got John Kerry saying that Iran is a country with a government that was elected and that sits in the United Nations. And it's important to us to deal with nation states in a way that acts in the best interests of all of us in the world. He added that Iran knows what to do. The president has made clear his determination to implement his policy that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
What do you make of...
How do you get to the elected, that Iran has an elected government when we were protesting the fact that we know for a fact that those weren't fair and
those
unbiased
elections
What are we
were
talking
rigged,
about here?
and we're talking about a highly repressive government nonetheless. What do you make of this attitude that all we need to do, in contrast to the Bush administration, is to cooperate with other people and go out of our way to hear their demands?
Well, look, let's talk about the fact that not everybody agrees with what we believe, first of all. And, when somebody says you can, in order for me to work with you, you need to compromise with me. And what they're asking you to compromise are your basic principles. Now, for me, I judge people whether or not they stand up for their principles. And guess what? The rest of the world judges the United States based on whether or not it stands up for what it believes in. When we say we are in support of democracy and we're in support of women's rights and things like that, we cannot then turn around and support governments that violate those things. And we're doing exactly that. We absolutely are in a position right now in which we're finding ourselves being asked to give up our principles because multiculturalism essentially is preferable. So when the other cultures say it's okay in our culture for women to not be allowed to drive or vote or any number of other things, you just need to accept that. It's okay for us to oppress religious minorities in our country, Christians and Jews or whoever, because that's what our culture says. That, as far as I understand American ideals to be, those violate American principles. And we simply cannot just accept that a culture hates people and wants to restrict liberties based on anything, whether it's religious ideas or anything else. We need to say, if you want to be an ally of the United States, you need to do these things. You need to support democracy. You need to support freedom of speech. You need to support women's rights. You need to support minority rights. If you can't do those things, we will limit our support or eliminate our support of your government. End of story.
Well, the contrasting viewpoint, do we have enough?
We'll have to talk about it after the break.
Okay.
So let's take a break. When we'll get back from our break, we'll talk about all of that. Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, who is the Jewish Community Relations Director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines. And Mark, we're talking about the soft policy here, soft American foreign policy, or softer American foreign policy. What are your thoughts?
Well, David, you are articulating the fact that American interests and I think world interests lie in promotion of a true democracy, true tolerance of minorities, and things that go along with that, such as the freedom of the press or free judiciary, all the hallmarks that we would consider to be essential in a real democratic government. In contrast to that, we've had over the last 25 years ago, the work of such people like Herbert Marcuse or Noam Chomsky, and especially Edward Said, whose book Orientalism had a major impact on left-wing thought. And that left-wing thought basically says that the United States and Western culture is truly repressive and exploitative of other cultures, and this has really influenced how some people have seen American foreign policy and have wanted to retool it in order to make it come more in line with international needs. Have you come across those ideas?
Well, we come across those ideas all the time. I mean, look, the reality is this. We're in a situation in which we've got growing Islamist rule in the Middle East. We are trying to figure out how to move forward with the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt and the growth of Islamists all over the place. And I think to a certain extent, we're trying to not have a foreign policy that is that hostile to those views.
Not confrontational. Yeah.
And if our foreign policy basically says we can't deal with anybody who's got those views, we don't have anybody we can deal with.
Except for Al-Qaeda, whose views have been segregated as especially egregious.
And so we're running into a situation here in which we don't necessarily want to say we can't deal with you if you have moderately oppressive religious views or even significantly oppressive religious views. We're going to deal with you anyway. But the problem I see here is the United States at some point has to say, look, we'll deal with you on a strategic basis, but we're not going to be happy about it, and we're not going to give you all the benefits of being our best buddy just because we need you this moment. We're not going to say wonderful things about the Turkish government of Erdogan, which we know is god-awful and is promoting all kinds of things that are anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israel, and anti-liberty, yes. And acting as if we love the guy so that he can turn around and use in his elections the fact that the United States is very supportive and thinks Turkey's a wonderful world leader. I mean, we can't possibly have a policy that does that. And that seems to be what our policy is right now. Let's make these guys who are promoting policies that are anti-American, anti-Western, anti-liberty, and make them feel good about what they're doing and make their people feel good about what they're doing. So they'll like America and think that we're not opposed to who they are.
Well, the two points here. The first is that there's a significant proportion of the American population who would agree with that in contradistinction to George Bush's regime, anything other than Bush is the proper way to go. And there's probably some validity to that, but it depends how far you want to go in order to overturn some bad things that happened in American foreign policy. In other words, the Iraq type of stuff really poisons the well for an objective understanding of current conflicts. Would you agree?
You know, I think there's an issue of people who are war weary. One,
that's just like after Vietnam,
and we certainly have people who are interested in trying to keep the United States from spending huge amounts of money on military stuff instead of other things that we could be spending money on. But for me, the problem comes in this idea of standing up for your principles, and at some point, you can't just say letting everybody do whatever they want is going to be our primary principle. At some point, the principle has to be we're going to stand up for democracy and what that really means. Democracy does not really mean we want one election and we don't care whatever happens after that. That's not being pro-democracy.
So do you think basically that some people are saying there's two threads here? The first is a reaction to mistakes made in Iraq. And the second reaction is people whose ideology is further to the left to begin with.
Well, what I don't understand is the people with ideology further to the left who are more socially liberal, who are advocating for policies that would allow governments that are oppressive right-wing governments to function, and they're arguing against the United States using its influence to try to help people. How can, I mean, you and I do a lot of work on Sudan, and we see this in dealing with Sudan advocacy all the time. The United States certainly has policies designed to combat genocide, but we're not using them against Sudan much at all. We've got sanctions against Sudan that we're allowing to be circumvented by promoting, by demanding that South Sudan send oil through Sudan, giving Sudan the income that it needs that it could otherwise get.
There's a difference there, though, David. It seems, if you take a strict left-wing view that the West is inherently exploitative, that's one thing. If perhaps the American administration says with Sudan, we would really like to do this, but our top priority is to prevent Sudan from warring against South Sudan. How do you understand those things?
Well, what I understand is that we can't have mutually exclusive policies. We actually have to deal with both issues. We have to say we're going to try to prevent war between Sudan and South Sudan, but we can't allow then Sudan to do whatever it wants to its civilian population, killing people, starving them to death, simply because we want to prevent a civil war. That's not okay. So this is where we got into isolationist policies after World War I. I tend to think that our position where we are right now is not 1939, like people say. I think we're post-World War I, and we've got this, it's the same mindset. We've got this, we don't want any war. We don't want war at all costs. Let's work with all these people who are actively pursuing war and violence, and we're going to allow them to continue advancing toward the point where they'll be very much more effective at pursuing war and violence, as long as they don't do it right now. And they can oppress their populations internally as much as they want, and as long as they don't do anything that dramatically affects the supply of oil, we're not going to care.
Okay.
I mean, that seems to be what Europe and the United States policy is right now, dealing with much of the world, and it's not okay. I'm not even sure that President Obama supports that policy. I think it's just where things are.
He may not have the ability to manipulate it to where he wants it to go. The reality is of how do you shift something that has its own forward motion to begin with. Leaving that aside for a second, we have the note here that Iran celebrates limited victory after latest P5+1 talks. In other words, whatever happens during those talks, there's a quote. It says, after 8 months of resistance by the people of Iran against excessive Western demands, finally the P5+1 agreed to negotiate within the framework of Iran's recommendation in Moscow. This is a major step in the negotiation process for the people of Iran. And that it's being used as a propaganda tool.
Well, look, I think that any negotiations are helpful to Iran right now, because the one thing Iran doesn't want to do is stop what it's doing. So as long as it can continue to talk, that's a benefit for Iran. If it gets any concessions at all, that's a major benefit from Iran. And what seems to happen is, as long as there's no reasonable threat of violence being used, that Iran
the forward motion will continue.
Iran can press. The more people argue that there's no military option, the less effective diplomatic pressure and economic pressure are going to be. And we're in a position right now where it's very clear that the anti-war feelings, not just war, the anti-military anything feelings are so strong that there's no credibility in the threats, or limited credibility in the threats of military action. And if all you can do is say, okay, you can have the Sudetenland as long as you give us peace, guess what? There's going to be one after the other, after the other, after the other, and pretty soon you got Poland and the rest of Europe. That's a problem. We can't put ourselves in that situation.
Okay, so the first thing is that through Secretary of State Kerry, we know that the United States is simply beginning its diplomatic effort with Iran, as opposed to what Hillary Clinton said, that there's a time limit.
Well, I don't know that that's true, Mark, because there have been a lot of reports lately that in fact, there's a belief right now that the administration is going to talk to Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan potentially about the fact that there may be military action coming up. Some of it may have to do with Syria, some of it may have to do with Iran, and that the summer time frame, June, July, may be when action is going to take place. That may be to ramp up that military threat that I just said to put it on the table. So, yes. Because you got to have that credible military threat in order for any of this other stuff to work. What you don't want is to have Iran call your bluff, because if Iran actually does call the bluff, then you really have no choice but to do military action, and you don't want to go there.
Right. Right.
The idea that you could not do military action at that point. And I think a lot of the pacifist community doesn't really understand this. If you don't do military action at that point, there's going to be a floodgate of violent action, aggressive military action throughout the world, with the understanding that the United States is not going to act against a major threat against the United States. For sure, it's not going to act against a minor threat against the United States. And even more so, it's for sure not going to act in defense of other communities and populations around the world. So if you're a minority person in any nation around the world, you better watch out if the United States is no military credible threat.
Because you're next.
Because you're next.
Yeah.
And so, this is going to be a recurring theme on our show as we move forward in the weeks ahead. We're going to have to wrap up for this week. This weekend is the American Israel Public Affairs Policy Conference in Washington, D.C. There will be a lot of things that will develop at that conference, certainly a lot more information about Syria and Iran and Israeli coalitions and any number of other things. And so next week, Mark and I will have quite a bit to discuss, just based on what happened in the Israeli policy, in the AIPAC policy conference, and what's going on in foreign policy in the Middle East in general. Thank you for joining us today on Understanding the World. Thank you once again to Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, for their sponsorship of the show. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week.